Hello to my friends joining us via recording. Today is April 16th. We're going to wrap up the second half of the spinal cord lecture to get us ready to move on into special senses next week. So here's a quick reminder. We're going to go back to where we first started with the spinal cord. Here's the very first image you have in the lesson number 12 packet here. When I talk about the spinal cord, remember that the spinal cord has one on the outside of the spinal cord, and we have the gray matter in the middle of the spinal cord. Remind me, was it white matter or gray matter? Which kind of matter has more myelin? Where do I find a lot of myelin? Is that in white or gray? Yeah, that's in the white. So I've got a lot of myelin in the white matter of the spinal cord, not as much myelin in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So yesterday during our class, we talked a lot about the gray matter of the spinal cord. Remember that different kinds of neurons live in these horns of the spinal cord. They each do different things. Let's see if we can remember. This one here on the back side of the spinal cord, this is called the dorsal horn. What was the general functional classification of the neurons that live back here? What functional type of neurons live in the dorsal horn? Do we remember who's in the back? Yeah, a couple of us are thinking correctly that the ones that live back here, these are the ones called the interneurons, the processing neurons. When we talk about the lateral horn on the side or the ventral horn on the front, in both of these places, we have motor neurons. When we talk about the motor neurons that control your skeletal muscles, so the muscles you use to take notes, for example, the motor neurons that control skeletal muscles, are they found in the lateral horn or the ventral horn? Who controls your skeletal muscles? Lateral horn or ventral horn? Yeah, so a few of us are chiming in. When I talk about skeletal muscles, those ones are going to be controlled by the motor neurons that live in the ventral horn. Remember, the word that we used for those were what we called somatic motor neurons. Somatic, meaning of the body, that's the ones that live here in the front. They go all over the body, they make you move, they help you take notes, they help you bend, all that kind of stuff. That's the ones that live in the ventral horn on the front side. There are two types of things that the neurons that live in the lateral horn control. Two types of muscle tissue. Let's be more specific here. What are the two types of muscle tissue that the lateral horn controls? The lateral horn controls smooth muscle. Yep, there's one vote. Smooth muscle that I find all over the place. And then also that cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle that I only find in one place in the body, and that one place is the heart. So smooth muscle is all over your organs. It's all over your blood vessels. It's all through the GI tract, all that kind of stuff. The directions to contract come from the lateral horn. Otherwise, when we're talking about the heart, that's a muscle that has cardiac muscle instead of smooth muscle inside of it. So remember a big picture idea that my cells that live in the gray matter, or the parts of my neurons and my types of neurons that live here in the gray matter, these are my thinking neurons. These are my neurons that get things done, whether we're processing with the dorsal horn with those interneurons, whether we're sending out information here with my motor neurons in the lateral horn or the ventral horn. Where, by the way, do sensory neurons live? We've only talked about interneurons in the dorsal horn and motor neurons in the lateral and ventral horn. Yeah, so I told you guys yesterday, right? We can abbreviate where those ones are found. Here, I'm going to draw it on this side of my picture over here. Here on the outside, I'm going to give this little neuron a cell body up here, and it's going to extend out. This guy here that lives on the outside of the spinal cord, let's change colors. There's this structure that we said yesterday was a must-know from lab. The structure that's a must-know is this bump out here on the back side of our spinal cord. It attaches back there. The dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion. This is where my sensory neurons live. So here's its little cell body. That's its thinking part. It collects information and sends that information straight into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. But my sensory neurons don't live in the spinal cord. They live outside the spinal cord in that thing called the dorsal root ganglion. So, quick reminder for us of the gray matter stuff. Also a reminder that yesterday we spent a lot of time talking about reflexes, and reflexes only involve this gray matter of the spinal cord. Or when we talk about a cranial reflex, they're only involving gray matter that's found in the middle of the brainstem, for example. So in a reflex, I get sensory information that comes in, I process that sensory information in the dorsal horn, and I predict my motor response right away, send it out. I don't have to involve the brain at all in that kind of information. What we're going to talk about today is what happens if that information comes in to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord, the way I like to think of it, is the spinal cord literally says, oh, this information is above my pay grade, and I don't know what to do with it. I need to send it up to the brain. Or when the brain has decided what we should do with things, the brain has to send those things back down. So what we're going to talk about today starts with this picture right here. Can anyone help me out with what page we have this picture in our outline? What page is this one found on? Page 6 to 7-ish. It's where we start talking about the white matter of the spinal cord. So when we talk about the white matter of the spinal cord, the white matter of the spinal cord is arranged in tracts. So when we talked reflexes, reflexes was all gray matter. When we talk about tracts, it's all white matter. Let's remind ourselves, we didn't talk about this specifically, which parts of a neuron do I find in the white matter of the spinal cord? Which parts of my neurons are in that white matter? Do we remember? Excuse me. Yeah, so this is the place where I have all of my axons, right? Remember we said what makes the white matter white is the fact that it has a whole bunch of myelin. So white matter has myelin, and myelin is found on axons. So when I talk about the spinal cord, all the places on the outside filled with white matter, they're also filled with the axons, the myelinated axons of my neurons. The job of a tract, or this white matter of the spinal cord, is to shoot information up to the brain or to bring information down from the brain. So the parts of my neuron that are best at sending information quickly are these axons. Now, I tried to give you guys the analogy in the guided lesson when you're looking at this cross-section of the spinal cord. Something I promise you I'm not going to ask on the exam or on the homework. Over here on the right side of the picture, these are my sensory tracts. And these ones over here on the left side are my motor tracts. Sensory and motor information. What I told you to think about on that guided lesson was pretend like this is a painting that you've made. And we decide to fold this painting right down the middle, fold it on itself. Oops, that's the wrong tool. Fold it right down the middle here and see what happens with the paint. The spaces over here that are white would be red, and the spaces over here that are white would be red. We fold it, and the opposite is true on the other side too. When I fold this, all these spaces would be blue, all these spaces would be blue. I told you for lab, if we ever put a marking anywhere in the white matter of a spinal cord model, you're going to tell us that we're looking at a funiculus or a tract. Because literally everywhere where there's white matter in the spinal cord, it's all arranged in these tracts. So here, let me give you that lab word. Remember that a tract, what we call them in lecture is a tract. In lab, they're called funiculi or a funiculus. It's the same thing. I just like the English word better. So we're going with tract. So anywhere in the white matter of the spinal cord, we have these tracts. Tracts are groups of axons that are either shooting up to the brain or shooting down from the brain out to the body. Carrie had a question about whether this is like that homunculus. That's a great way to think about it. However, each half of your brain on that precentral and postcentral gyrus, each half has the same map, but it's a mirror image of each other. Absolutely. So all this stuff that I can see on this side, it's also present over here. They just didn't show it to you. All the stuff I can see over here is also present here. They just didn't show it to us. So everywhere throughout the white matter of the spinal cord, we have special places that are always sending information up and special places that are always sending information down. For my friends who had a chance to finish this lesson, help me out here. We have motor tracts and we have sensory tracts. The way that we describe tracts, one of the things we have to think about them is whether they are ascending or descending. When I say something is an ascending tract, that means it sends information up, literally, physically up in your body. Would that be the job of a motor tract to send information up or a sensory tract? Who sends information up? Yes, lots of us are chiming in. Sensory tracts are called ascending tracts. Ascending tracts. Ascending means we're literally going up. So remember the deal with tracts here. Tracts, their job is to send information to the brain or away from the brain. So sensory tracts are collecting information from your fingers, from your toes, from your abdominal pelvic cavity, and they're sending it literally up to the brain. So when you think about a sensory tract, we should automatically in our mind make the connection, this is an ascending tract. I'm taking sensory information up to the brain. That means when we talk about motor tracts, we're talking about descending tracts. Descending means I'm literally sending information down. So a motor tract, most of these are going to start up at the, here let's do a lab correlation here. Most of these start in the precentral gyrus. There's a lab reminder for us. Precentral gyrus. If you remember from lab and from lecture, the precentral gyrus is the place where we have that motor homunculus, the map where we make the decisions about what parts of our body we're contracting when. Most of these motor tracts are going to start way up there in the precentral gyrus. We're going to talk about today one that doesn't start in the precentral gyrus. We'll talk about one that starts down in the brainstem. But most of them are going to start up in the cerebrum, where you have your conscious decisions for movements. So, big things so far. Motor tracts send information down. They're sending directions for motor movements. Sensory tracts send information up. They're collecting information that needs to be processed by the brain, or maybe it needs to be processed by the the brain stem, some of those structures there. Again, like I mentioned, I promise I am not going to give you this picture and say, are these sensory or motor? Are these sensory or motor? But I included the picture to show you guys that literally everywhere you've got white matter, we've got a tract there. That's why it's always the answer in lab. If there's a pin on the white matter, it's always the funiculi. It's always a tract because they're everywhere. Okay, so when we talk about tracts, we're going to start with, let me get a whiteboard here. We're going to start with talking about our ascending tracts. Ascending tracts. I don't have all the words in front of me, so I'm going to rely on you guys to help me out with making my list here. So let's work together to make our list about ascending tracts. When I talk about ascending tracts, the ones that take information up, how many neurons do we typically have in an ascending tract? Who remembers from their work? How many neurons do we normally have in ascending tracts? Yes, ascending tracts typically have 3 neurons. That is an underline highlight star idea. How many neurons do I usually have in an ascending tract? I usually have 3. There are usually 3 that are involved. When I talk about these 3 neurons, they have special names. So I like the names of these neurons because they tell me the order that I find them in, right? So we've got what's called the first order neuron. We have the second order neuron. And we have the third order neuron. When I talk about these 3 neurons, here's their 3 names. Here's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge for me. You should never tell me there's a first order neuron in a descending tract. These types of neurons, first order neurons, are only found in ascending tracts. So never tell me that one of these lives in a descending tract or in a motor tract. Never tell me a second order neuron or a third order neuron lives in a descending tract. These are specific just to my ascending tracts. They're only found in ascending tracts. So my first order neuron, can someone help me out? How could we describe what the first order neuron does? What's the function of the first order neuron, or the first one that's here in the line here? What does it do? Okay, so Carrie mentioned for me something it has. Yeah, so this, the first order neuron is going to be my sensory neuron. It has, so it's a sensory neuron that collects information. I like that, collects information. So the end of this neuron, it has a receptor or something that I can use to receive that information. My first order neuron in an ascending tract is where my sensory information comes from. So feeling a sensation in your finger, here's where that information is collected by the first order neuron. So your first order neuron is found anywhere in the body where it's collecting information. My first order neuron needs to synapse with or connect with the second order neuron. So my first order neuron takes sensory information, collects somewhere in the body. Where does my first order neuron have to go to be able to talk to the second order neuron? Where does it have to go to get that information to the second order neuron? Or in other words, where's the cell body of the second order neuron? Yeah, it's in the spinal cord. Yes, so my first order neuron takes information to the spinal cord, So a couple of us mentioned this for me. The first order neuron lives in the dorsal root ganglion. It lives in that bump on the outside. And it brings its information to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So my first order neuron collects sensory information from all over in the body. It takes that information from its little receptors that I find on your fingers, on your toes, wherever, and I send that information back through the dorsal root ganglion all the way into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. The dorsal horn of the spinal cord is where I meet up with my second order neuron. And the second order neuron, I think, well, maybe we didn't mention this yet. The second order neuron, since it lives in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, what functional classification would we say the second order neuron is? If it lives in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, yeah, when the ones that live in the dorsal horn, this second order neuron here, this is an interneuron. This is an interneuron. Cannot spell that. Okay. This is an interneuron. This interneuron lives in the spinal cord. It lives in the dorsal horn. It gets the sensory information from the first order neuron. And it is this guy, the second order neuron, that says, oh my gosh, I can't process this. I don't know what to do with this. I got to send it up the chain of command. Somebody else has to figure this out for me. So the second order neuron that starts in the dorsal root ganglion is going to shoot all the way up to a particular part of the brain. When I talk about where my second order neuron sends its information, it sends its information to the place that we said kind of help to filter or sort information in the brain. Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in here. The second order neuron goes up to the thalamus. The thalamus. So the second order neuron, it starts in the dorsal horn, but when it gets that information, it says, oh, I can't deal with this. Its axon shoots up through the white matter all the way up in the brain to the thalamus. Because remember, the thalamus I use to sort my information, to get it to the right place. So far we've talked about the first order neuron that collects the information. The second order neuron tries to process it, says, I can't do this. I'm going to send it up to the brain, up to the thalamus. The third order neuron then is going to be the neuron that goes from the thalamus to the right part of the brain. Typically what I mean by the right part of the brain is the right part of the sensory homunculus. The right part of the sensory homunculus. Is this information that came from your fingers? Is this information that came from your leg? Wherever that information came from, my third order neuron will make sure it gets to that particular place on the map. So yeah, I saw a comment about it being in the cerebral cortex. That's absolutely right. So here's terminology for us back from the brain chapter. Cerebral cortex. That's the gray matter on the outside of the brain. That I find the sensory homunculus. That's where I find that map of your body, is inside that cerebral cortex. So what do we need to know about ascending tracts? First thing we need to know is that ascending tracts are sensory tracts. They're always sending information up in the brain. Second thing we need to know about ascending tracts is that they have 3 neurons. For the most part, they're going to have 3. Those 3 neurons each have their own name. First order, second order, third order. For each of those neurons, you need to know where it lives and what it does. So please make sure we know about these 3 neurons. Make sure we know, generally speaking, what it is that they do or where I would find them. If they don't do a lot of something functionally, at least what it is or where it is that I can find them. So let's go back to our picture here, or let's go back to our slides, excuse me. We're going to talk about a couple of ascending tracts. Here's my first ascending tract. And help me out here. What page do I have the Spinothalamic tract on? What page is the Spinothalamic tract on? Okay, looks like page 7. All right, so we're talking about our first ascending tract here. What I will tell you guys on exam number 4 is I'm going to give you the name of a tract that you've never seen before, but I promise you, you're going to be able to use the name of that tract to figure out if it's ascending or descending. So we're going to do practice with each of these tracts that we're looking at here to figure out if they are ascending or descending. The way I can figure that out is by looking at the structures in their name. So there's 2 parts to the name of this tract. The first part is spinal. The second part is thalamic. This is not a trick question, I promise. This spino part of its name, what structure does spino sound a lot like? Spino, yeah, sounds like the spine, right? Or the spinal cord. If I have the beginning part of my name that has this spino part in it, I'm referring to the spinal cord. The spinal cord. Second part of my name, again, this is not a trick question. It's called thalamic. What part does thalamic sound like? Yeah, it sounds just like the thalamus. Okay, so this is not hard. I have a tract. Its name is Spinothalamic. The first part of its name tells me where it starts. It starts in the spinal cord. The second part of my name tells me where it goes to. It goes to the thalamus. If you think about your anatomy in the body, the spinal cord is below the thalamus. To go from the spinal cord to the thalamus, I have to go up physically, literally in your body. So if you're looking at the name of a tract that starts with something that's lower than what it ends with, that makes me, like Eileen said for us here, that makes me an ascending tract. An ascending tract. And by the way, ascending tracts were those sensory or motor. Ascending tracts. Information going up. Is that sensory or motor? Yes. This is a sensory tract. An ascending tract is a sensory tract. Okay, so we have no idea what this tract does at this point, but we know that it's sensory because its name tells me it starts in the spinal cord and it ends somewhere in the brain. It sends information up to the brain, spinothalamic. When we talk about the spinothalamic tract, since it is an ascending tract, notice that it has 3 neurons in it. First order neuron, second order neuron, third order neuron. They're all different colors. So the first order neuron is the one that I see right here. See this one down here in red? Remember that the first order neuron was the one that collected sensory information. So I can see it here in red. Remember that sensory neurons live outside the spinal cord in that dorsal root ganglion. This neuron collected the information, took it in to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. That information comes in to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord where the second order neuron lives, and the second order neuron tries to process it. Emphasis on the tries. It gets that information and says, I have no idea what to do with this. We got to send it up. It's got to go up the food chain. So notice then that this second order neuron that I see right here has an axon that branches into the white matter and shoots straight up through all of the spinal cord parts, all the way through the brainstem up to the thalamus. The thalamus is where this second order neuron ends. This is where I see its axon terminals. Once it's there in the thalamus, its axon terminals synapse with or meet with a third order neuron that I see here in light blue that sends that information up to the right place on that sensory homunculus. So there are a ton of different neurons that live here in the thalamus. They branch, let's add a few more that aren't getting information. They branch everywhere up here on this homunculus. We can send this information to any part wherever it matches within the body. Remember, the job of the thalamus was my filter or my relay station. So there's all kinds of third order neurons up there that are just waiting to get the information that relates to them to send it to the right place in the body. Now, you may have noticed, and I kind of purposely ignored it here, see how there's two yellow lines that I see right here? We actually have more than one of these spinothalamic tracts. We have one that's called the lateral spinothalamic tract, and we have one that's called the anterior spinothalamic tract. When I use this word anterior, what does the word anterior mean? Anterior. Yeah, we're chiming in. That's a lab word for us, right? Anterior. So this word anterior right here means that it's toward the front. If you check out this line, if we trace this second order neuron, this is the one that I find toward the front of the spinal cord on the anterior side. We also have this word lateral. What does lateral mean? The word lateral? Yeah, that means that it's more on the side, right? If something is lateral, it's toward the outside of the body. If something is medial, it's toward the middle. So lateral spinothalamic tract is the one that's found more toward the outside. The anterior one is the one that's found more toward the front. I promise you, I'm not going to ask you to tell me on the exam what specific kinds of information the lateral spinothalamic tract carries, or what specific kind of information the anterior spinothalamic tract carries. I'm not going to ask you that. That's minutia that you don't need to know. What you do need to know is that these two tracts carry different information. So the information that goes up the front side of the spinal cord and the anterior spinothalamic tract, this is information like crude touch. So what I mean by that is like the general shape of something. That's what crude touch tells me. What shape is it? That's things like pressure. So how heavy is something? The lateral spinothalamic tract is going to be the place that I send information related to things like temperature or pain. So is it hot? Is it cold? Is it extremely hot or cold? That kind of information goes up the lateral spinothalamic tract. So this interneuron right here, my second order neuron, it actually has two different pathways that it sends information up depending on the kind of information it got from the first order neuron. So the first order neuron collected information, maybe more than one type of information, sent that to my second order neuron. The second order neuron processes it a little bit and says, oh, this is pressure information, or this is temperature information that needs to go up to the brain because the brain's got to figure out what to do with it. It sends it up in a particular location in the spinal cord where it meets with a neuron in the thalamus to sort it out to where it goes. So our first example of an ascending tract, the spinothalamic tracts, remember there are two of them that send slightly different information, but this idea of where the first order, second order, and third order neuron lives, that's the big thing that we want to hone in on this tract. Let me pause for a moment. What questions, if any, do we have right now about the spinothalamic tracts? Or give me a thumbs up if we're feeling okay about this one. Or two, I guess, right? There's two of them. The anterior and the lateral spinothalamic tracts. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay. Well, I'm getting a lot of thumbs up. I'm even getting my penguin, which is awesome. Help me remember to draw you a penguin here at the end of our class time today. We should be able to draw a penguin today. This the spinothalamic tracts, when we're talking about those, they are what we might call a stereotypical ascending tract, meaning that they have basically everything you would expect in a typical spinothalamic tract. They've got these three neurons that we talked about. It's very easy to see that they're in various places. So this is a very typical ascending tract for us. I did see that question. The question was, how is it possible for this neuron to have two different branches? So we didn't talk a lot about how neurons can be adapted, but neurons can have branches that go off of their axon. So we can have more than one, dried little ugly really fast, more than one branch of my axon, and they can determine kind of which branch is being activated based on when they do the process of summation, based on how quickly they reach threshold, or based on the kinds of information they got, that kind of stuff. So they can have more than one branch that goes to more than one place. It is also possible to, remember my first order neuron here, my neuron that collects information. My first order neuron can talk to more than one second order neuron. So there may be more than one second order neuron that this one is talking to, that also contributes to which of these pathways we go up. So yeah, this could be one, or it could be two different second order neurons. Yeah, good question about those tracts there. Okay, so spinothalamic, from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Now we get a little bit trickier here. Our next one is called the Spinocerebellar Tract. Okay, so let's start that spino part. Spino still means the same thing. So spino still means what? What did that spino part mean? Yeah, still means the spine, or more specifically, still means the spinal cord. Spino still means we start in the spinal cord. Not a trick question. What do we think cerebellar means? Not a trick. Yep. Several chiming in. Cerebellar looks just like cerebellum, and that is indeed what it tells me. Okay, here's where, again, we know nothing in particular about this tract, but we know that it starts in the spinal cord and it ends in the cerebellum. The spinal cord is below the cerebellum. Because the spinal cord is below the cerebellum, yeah, Pilar chimed in for us, this is another ascending tract. Ascending tract. I start with a structure that is physically below where I end up at. This is another ascending tract. And again, ascending tracts are what kind of tract? Are they sensory or motor? Ascending tracts. Sensory or motor? Yeah, a few of us are chiming in here for me. Since it's an ascending tracts are always sensory. They're always bringing info up. We collect it and we send it up. When we talk about the Spinocerebellar tract, let's go through, since it's an ascending tract, remember that we start with a first order neuron. So my first order neuron, you can see it here in blue. My first order neuron, here's its cell body and the dorsal root ganglion. It comes inside the spinal cord, goes to the dorsal horn, and it synapses with my second order neuron, shown here in red. Second order neuron says, oh, I don't know what to do with this information. I got to shoot it up. So notice that its axon jumps over into the white matter of the spinal cord, and it shoots straight up. We're traveling through the spinal cord, up through the brain stem. Second order neuron goes to the cerebellum. Not a trick question, I promise. Do we see a third order neuron in this picture? Do we see one here? Yeah, no, it's not a trick question, right? There is no third order neuron. That is an underlined highlight star idea here with Spinocerebellar Tract. There is no third order neuron. There is not one. I can't see it because it's not there. Let's remind ourselves. Let's see who can remember it. Yeah, this particular ascending tract only has two. That's correct, Eileen. This makes it it's a special case. Spinocerebellar only has two. Remind me here. Let's see if we remember. Where does the third order neuron usually live Where does it start? Flip back in your notes. Third order neuron is located exactly in the thalamus. It's located in the thalamus. But this tract doesn't go as high as the thalamus. We never get to the thalamus. We stop at the cerebellum. So this particular ascending tract is a special case because there's only a first order and a second order neuron there. There's no third order neuron. Because remember, that third order neuron lived in the thalamus. Well, if I don't go to the thalamus, there's no third order neuron. So this one is different from the spinothalamic tract in that I don't have a third order neuron to sort that information out. However, I am still an ascending tract because I'm still going up. So a good activity for you to consider doing, because remember I like to try to give you guys study activities. We want to compare, excuse me, compare, we've had the spinothalamic, I'm going to abbreviate because it's too long, the spinothalamic tracts to the Spinocerebellar tract. We want to compare things like how many neurons do each of these tracts have inside of them. We want to compare things like what kinds of information do they transport. We want to compare things like where do they start and where do they end. This would be a really good, remember we would do a lot when we were in class together, right? We do a compare and contrast. So I'd set you up a thing on the board like this. And we would compare and contrast the spinothalamic tracts to the spinocerebellar tracts. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that I would recommend you outline your information like this, just to give you a chance to practice with it, to make sure we understand the important differences. Again, let me highlight for you, just to make sure we know, I am never going to ask you on the exam, which particular kind of information does the spinocerebellar tract send? Or which particular information does the anterior spinothalamic tract send? I'm not going to ask you the specific kind, but the reason I put it on here on our outline list is to help you remember, hey, each of these different kinds of tracts send different kinds of information. So here's a study tool I would recommend for you guys. Make yourself a compare and contrast table because that's always helpful. So we talked about the spinothalamic tracts. We've talked about the spinocerebellar tract. Hey, let's talk about or look at, let's start looking at one that's called the corticospinal tract. Corticospinal. The beginning part, cortico, is new to us. For my friends who've worked on this lesson, help me out. The beginning part, cortico, what does cortico stand for? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in here. Cortico comes from the word cortex. That means the cerebral cortex. And we used that word a little earlier today. The cerebral cortex is the gray matter on the outside of the cerebrum. So I've got this beginning part, cortico, that tells me we're on the outside of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. And look, we've got my favorite part here, spinal. Not a trick question. What does spinal refer to? Spinal is going to refer to, yep, as usual, as it has the last several times, it's going to mean the spinal cord. Okay, so check this one out. Cerebral cortex, that's the outside of the brain, to the spinal cord. Is this one an ascending tract or a descending tract? Yeah, this is our first example of a descending tract. A descending tract. So I figured that out. Let's remind ourselves, because we have this cortico beginning part, the cerebral cortex. That's where I start. I always start with the beginning of their name. And I end at the spinal cord. I go from my brain into the spinal cord, or what you'll see more specifically, and it talks about this in the lesson here, maybe more specifically we could say the spinal nerves. That's technically where my neuron's going to end up. Okay, we need to talk about descending tracts, because we haven't talked about descending tracts yet. When we talk about a descending tract, descending tracts, they're sending information down. The information that they're sending down, is that sensory or is that motor? What kind of information goes down? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in. Descending tracts going from the cerebral cortex down into the body. These are motor tracts, or motor tracts. Motor tracts send directions. So we got a descending motor tract here. Descending tracts in general, for my friends who worked on this lesson, how many neurons do I usually have in descending tracts? Yeah, descending tracts, we want to know that descending tracts have 2 neurons. They have 2 neurons in them. Always. That's going to be the way that a descending tract works. Remind me, in general, how many neurons did an ascending tract have? How many do most ascending tracts have? Yeah, usually they have 3. Spinocerebellar was a special case, right? Because it never made it up to the thalamus, but usually those ones have 3. So another wink, wink, nudge, nudge study tip, right, is to make yourself a table that compares ascending tracts to descending tracts. How many neurons do they have? That's a really good comparison to make. So descending tracts, they just have 2. Descending tracts always start higher and they end lower based on their name. So I can use their name to figure those things out. When I talk about descending tracts, I have a completely different set of names for the neurons that are in these tracts. And hey, the good news is the names are super easy. Can we light me up in the chat here? What are the names of the 2 types of neurons in descending tracts? Yeah, it's really easy. It's upper motor neurons and it's lower motor neurons. Exactly. Upper and lower motor neurons. And it's not a trick question to where you find them. The upper motor neuron is what we find up higher, and the lower motor neuron is what we find going down lower. So when we're talking about the lower motor neuron, this is going to be the one that actually goes out with or leaves the spinal cord to synapse with muscles. Because it's a motor tract, we're controlling the contraction of muscles. The lower motor neuron goes out and synapses with muscles. The upper motor neuron is the one that we typically find in the brain or the brain stem that kind of comes up with the ideas. So it decides what we're doing. Upper motor neuron makes the decision. Lower motor neuron makes it happen. In a descending tract, we just have the 2 neurons. We don't have the 3 like we had in an ascending tract. So, important difference between ascending and descending is the number of neurons that they have. Another important difference, what the kinds of information they transport. Is it sensory information or motor information? This particular tract is the corticospinal tract. So we start in the cerebral cortex on the outside of the brain. More specifically, when we're talking about the cerebral cortex, we're talking about, here it comes again, the precentral gyrus. We're talking about that bump that has the motor homunculus inside of it. So we're starting this tract in the place where we got that really funky map inside your brain. My neuron that lives up there, so here it is at the top, my neuron that lives in the motor homunculus, that's my upper motor neuron. Notice that we've decided we want to move our fingers, for example. So that neuron travels down through the spinal cord, down through the pons and the medulla, all the way through the spinal cord until we reach the level that's going out into our arms, for example, if we're going to take notes. At this point, notice that I'm synapsing with a neuron that lives in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So the ventral horn of the spinal cord is where I had the motor neurons that control skeletal muscle. So I synapse with a neuron that lives in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, my lower motor neuron, and I send that information out of the spinal cord, out into the body. Corticospinal tract, the tract that you use to contract your skeletal muscle cells. We can tell from our picture it's skeletal muscle because we're there in that dorsal horn. Help me out. What questions do we have about the corticospinal tract or about descending tracts in general? What questions do we have at this point? Excuse me. Let me go off mic so you don't have to hear me blow my nose. Or give me a thumbs up. If you have no questions, give me a thumbs up. All right, well, I got thumbs up and penguins, so we're going to call that a win. Let's look at our last tract for the day, right here. This one is called the Vestibulospinal Tract. Vestibulospinal. Now, ooh, I like that. I got a little hang 10, right? Or stay cool. Or way back in the day when I was in middle school, this was the call me, right? Call me. So whatever it may be, I got something awesome. So that's great. Okay. Vestibulo is new to us. We'll come back to that part. Spinal is not new to us. Spinal is always popping up here. Again, for the last time, this is the last time I'll ask you, when I use this spinal part, what do I mean when I use spinal in the name? What structure is that referring to in the body? We're all really tired of answering this question for me, right? There we go. Okay. When I use the part spinal, it still always means the spinal cord, or it still always means the spine. Okay. This vestibulo part, let's go back to vestibulo. Vestibulo, here's the technical word for what it means. It means the vestibule. The vestibule. And we are going to talk about that next week when we do special senses. So the vestibule is found, yeah, like Pilar said, it's found in the internal ear. So this is going to be things that we talk about called the semicircular canals. Excuse me, semicircular canals. It's also going to be things called the saccule and the utricle. So these are going to be words that mean more to us next week. But all of these structures together, we call them the vestibule. The place in the body that I find the vestibule, like Pilar mentioned for us, this is structures in the internal ear. Internal ear. Hey, does anyone happen to remember either the name or the number of the cranial nerve that collects information from the vestibule? Yeah, Carrie's got the number for me. Number 8. Its name is like insane, right? Cranial nerve number 8. Cranial nerve number 8, I'll type it for you because, like I said, the name is pretty insane. Some of us might be trying to type it, right? Its name is called vestibulo. Hey, look, vestibulocochlear. Vestibulocochlear nerve. That's cranial nerve number 8. Roman numerals number 8, right there. The vestibulo part of its name tells me that it collects information from the semicircular canals, the saccule, the utricle. This kind of information is balance information. So we'll put a note here. The internal ear helps you with balance. I know you guys can answer this one for me. The cochlear part of its name tells me what else does this nerve help me do? Cochlear. Yeah, it's found in the ear. It also helps with hearing. Exactly. Hearing. This would be a good wink, wink, nudge, nudge lab reminder for us. Vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8. This is my cranial nerve that does hearing and balance. Vestibulocochlear nerve. So yeah, the technical word for balance is equilibrium. So vestibulocochlear nerve, hearing and balance nerve. Hey, this tract in the spinal cord starts at the part of the body where the vestibulocochlear nerve attaches. And this vestibulo part is the balance part. So the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8, is a nerve that attaches to the brainstem. All this funky stuff that I see going on up here, all we know is this isn't the brain, right? All you really need to know is this isn't the brain. This is somewhere in the brainstem. So we attach to the brainstem, and that's where I find my upper motor neuron, my first neuron that's collecting information or processing information that came from the internal ear, the balancing center. The vestibulospinal tract starts in the brainstem, where my balance information is being processed, where it's being figured out in conjunction with the cerebellum. And we're going to send directions down the spinal cord or down out through the parts of the spinal cord to help me with balance. The vestibulospinal tract, its job, make it look nice, the job of this tract is to help you balance. My upper motor neuron, the one that's helping me to decide what I'm going to be doing, it's collecting a whole lot of information from parts of the pons, from parts of the medulla oblongata, from the cerebellum. It's collecting a bunch of information and figuring out, kind of like when you're walking, right, and you start walking a little bit funky, figuring out, okay, we really need to make sure our foot's not curved in so much. We got to curve it back out. The upper motor neuron in the vestibulospinal tract will send out directions really fast, faster than you even think about it, actually. Send out directions really fast to your skeletal muscles to make sure that you don't fall over. So the vestibulospinal tract, because it starts in the brainstem instead of in the cerebral cortex, for this one, you don't really control it like we did with the corticospinal tract. This one we might, to borrow a word that we used in the muscle chapter, this one is more involuntary in the sense that you didn't consciously decide what kind of information goes in this tract. You're the information in this tract because it's helping you to balance. Balance is not something you have to be in charge of. So that's helpful. You're not in charge of this tract. It keeps you balanced even without you being in charge of it. But again, if we knew nothing else about this tract, vestibulo tells me that the information comes from the same place that the vestibule sends information, that's in the brainstem, and it goes down to the spinal cord. So on the exam, I'll give you the name of a tract you haven't seen before. Please don't freak out. Look for, here's your biggest tip right here. Look for where I find spinal, or where I find, we saw a whole lot of spino at the beginning. Look for the location of these things. If I start with spino and I end with anything, that's going to be an ascending tract. If I end with spinal, that's always going to be a descending tract. So don't let these big funky names freak you out. Use the location of this spinal part to help you know if it is ascending or descending. That's the big thing we want to be able to predict based on their names. That is the tracts. That's the white matter stuff. What questions do we have, if any, at this point about those tracts? Any last minute questions about ascending or descending tracts? Or you can give me a thumbs up. Right about now is a good time to draw a penguin for you. Let's draw you a penguin. I got one thumbs up. There we go. We're starting to have a dance party. Okay. Oh, good question, Kathleen. I spaced on talking about direct versus indirect. No, so I did not talk about that. Thank you for mentioning that for me. Yeah, so there are two types of motor tracts. When we talk about motor tracts, we have, let's see if we'll do it here at the very bottom here. When I talk about motor tracts, we have what are called direct motor tracts, and we have what are called indirect motor tracts. Honestly, the best way to kind of think about these two motor tracts, a direct motor tract, technically speaking, how we know it's direct is that these ones start in the cerebrum, or they start in the cerebral cortex, as we outlined on the other thing. A fast way to remember direct tracts too, though, is you directly control these. You decide the directions that go down these pathways. Indirect motor tracts are going to start anywhere else in the body besides the cerebral cortex. So they're going to start in the brainstem. They could start potentially in the cerebellum. If it starts anywhere except the cerebral cortex, then it's called an indirect motor tract for us. And that ties into what we just said, that this particular tract we're looking at, which is an indirect one, we don't control it directly. We're not deciding when our muscles contract to help us not fall over. So an indirect motor tract, we're starting somewhere besides the cerebral cortex. That's what that terminology means. So thank you for reminding me about that. I spaced on talking about that with you guys. Direct versus indirect. Okay, so the question is, what's the function of the corticospinal tract? Let me bounce back. Everybody say goodbye to the penguin. He's going to go away for us here. The question is about the corticospinal tract. So let me pull that one back up. That's one picture back. What are some of the things that you guys wrote in your notes? What does the corticospinal tract help us to do? Any ideas? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in. This one is all about conscious movement of muscles. So specifically, it's really involved a lot in movement of your arms. But if you just generally know that the corticospinal tract is conscious movement, you decided to do these movements, that's the biggest difference between the corticospinal tract and vestibulospinal tract. Cortico is a direct motor pathway. So you decided to move specifically your arms and your trunk. Okay, so I'm looking over what we have left here. Help me out in the chat. So look at the end of your notes packets. We're now hitting kind of the point that's a little bit hodgepodge. Different disorders, so applications. I want you guys to help me out. Carrie already sent in one question for us. What are the things we want to make sure we talk about in the time that we have left during our office hours here? Carrie wants to talk about that journal article, so we can definitely talk about that journal article. Actually, it's not the full article, right? It's just a summary of it. But we can definitely talk about that. We'll work on that together as a class. Talk about a spinal tap. Okay, yeah, we can mention the spinal tap. That's what my cartoon was for the day, right? It was about a spinal tap, also known as a lumbar puncture. Okay, well, let's start with those things. And we will, yeah, then maybe mention the damage to the spinal cord. Let's see how our timing goes, and we'll just plan for that. So our journal article here, let me pull that up. Hey, let's do an informal poll, because I would totally do this poll if I was in class with you guys, if we were in person. This is what we call an abstract. Oh, my lines are gone. Okay. This is what we call an abstract for a scientific article, meaning it's a summary. You work on a project for like 5 years of your life, and then you write the entire thing in one paragraph. So not that I'm bitter at all about scientific papers, says your instructor, but this is somebody's life work that they worked really hard on, and they summarized it all together in one paragraph for us to read. The goal of this particular study was to understand a little bit better this disease called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Short name for it is ALS. So I mentioned for you guys in the guided lesson, this was the thing back in the day when there was the ice bucket challenge. This is the disease that they were hoping to understand a little bit better. So this is research about that disease. This is a disease that affects the motor tracts in the body. So the descending tracts. The goal of this study was to understand, let me bounce back one picture here. The goal of this study, ooh, my pictures are crazy, sorry. Scientists knew when they looked at patients with ALS, they looked down at those patients' muscles. For example, ALS affects descending pathways, so the ones that control muscle tissue. When they looked at a patient with ALS, with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the size of the muscles on those patients were much smaller. They also noticed that those neurons that go straight to the muscles were also smaller than usual. They looked a little bit wasted, or they weren't as big as usual. When I talk about, by the way, a motor tract, and we're talking about the neuron that goes down and attaches to the muscle tissue, what was the name of the type of neuron in a descending tract that goes down and actually synapses with the muscle tissue? Which of those two kinds of neurons in the tract is the one that synapses with the muscle tissue? Yeah, we might need a reminder for ourselves about the names of the neurons in a descending tract. Descending tracts have what are called upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. So when I'm talking about the ones that go all the way down and synapse with muscles, these are the lower motor neurons. The lower motor neurons. Scientists knew that the muscle tissue in their patients with ALS was wasted. It wasn't as big as normal. They knew that the lower motor neurons that were sending information to or causing the contraction of these muscles were also kind of wasted, or they were smaller than normal. What they didn't know necessarily is what was also going on with the upper motor neurons. So you remember the lower motor neurons give the message to the muscle cells, telling them to contract, but the lower motor neurons get that information from an upper motor neuron who decided whether or not we should do contraction. Scientists kind of wanted to do the chicken and the egg thing. They wanted to figure out, okay, so is it just that this neuron that sends messages to muscle cells has just kind of shrunk and stopped doing its job? Or is the reason that it shrunk and stopped doing its job because the upper motor neuron that was supposed to tell it what its job was, is that neuron malfunctioning as well? When we look at this abstract that I asked you guys to read, we're looking at it to figure that out. That's basically our big picture goal. We want to look at cortical motor neurons. These are the ones that live in the cerebral cortex. And we want to look at lower motor neurons, the ones that go down and synapse with muscles, to see how their sizes compare. Now I've got text on top of my thing up here. I think I can point to it right there. Notice the year that this paper was written right here. This paper was written in 1991. So this is not like cutting edge research, right? This has been around for a little while. But here's what I always do in class. So I'm going to do it here in our virtual classroom too. If this paper was written before you were born, can you raise your hand for me underneath the screen? There's a little raise hand thing. I'm just curious how many of us were born after this paper was published. How many of us came after the paper? Yeah, not as many as usual, because usually when I'm in the classroom, it's probably like 2/3 or 3/4 of the class, and it always makes me sad because, like Eileen, you know, got the crying emoji, right? I was definitely around when this paper came out. Some of us were not yet, which is totally fine. It's just always a little fun thing for me to do. I had 3 people raise their hand, in case you're wondering. So you were old by then, Eileen says, yeah. So 3 to 4 of us were not born yet when this paper came out. So obviously they've done a lot of research since then. And the Ice Bucket Challenge, I was looking it up the other day, was actually really helpful for ALS research. They got a lot of funding that came out of that. So there's definitely more out there for us to know about ALS than this paper, but this is a good place for us to start to help us understand. I lost my underlines here, so let me try to underline them here. Let's see if I can find it. I think it's this right here is the yellow. Okay, and then I know it went longer. I'm just going to underline that, and then let's see. This was underlined, and then let me find my blue. All right, so here's what we would do if we were in class and we were working on this activity. In class, I would pull up Poll Everywhere, and I would have all of us text in for me the words in each statement that we understand. So we've got a little chat box, which is perfect, and I hope that all of us will contribute here for me, because I know you all can help me out with this. We're going to start here with the yellow statement. Now, I guess to be fair, I should probably underline all of it, right, to give us lots of chances here. Okay. There are lots of words, even if you read this yellow underlined statement here and you don't know what it means, what the whole thing means, I know there are words in here that you do know what they mean. And it can be the simplest, most basic words. What I would love for you to do for me in the chat box here, look at this whole statement that's underlined in the yellow orange here. Can you type for me in the chat, what are some of the words that you do know what they mean? Even the most basic words, I want to know what those are. I mean, not the, right? But give me some of the words that we see in here that we do understand. Let's see what some of those words are. Try to keep up with us here. Nice. Sporadic. Foot, tongue. Awesome. Yeah, and controls. Perfect. Okay, so check this out. See, normally what we would do in class, remember with Poll Everywhere, how it would make some words bigger and some words smaller. I went through and tried to catch a lot of the words that you guys told me you understood. I circled them for us. By the way, it's always really funny to me when I do this with students and they're like, she can't possibly be asking me about foot and tongue. Like, I can't possibly send those in. And so like my map shows up and I always tell them, like, guys, I failed you as an anatomy teacher. You don't know what the foot and the tongue are. So I'm glad you all told me that you know what the foot and the tongue are. That's good. Not a total failure here as an anatomy teacher. Multiple of you mentioned for me the precentral gyri. Gyri is just plural for gyrus. So this is that bump we've been talking a lot about in the brain and with muscle stuff. Several of us mentioned the word cells. That's awesome because that was like our first unit, right? I really like that several of us also said sporadic. Hey, can you help me out in the chat? For those of you that said you know what sporadic means, what does sporadic mean? We talked about this way back in Unit 2. Sporadic. I'm going to mute you again here for a moment. Give me. So I like the way that Kathleen put it when she was describing what sporadic means. When we're talking about a disease that is sporadic, we talked about sporadic Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Remember CJD, the human version of mad cow disease? That's where that word sporadic came from in our anatomy class, was Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. When we talked about Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, there were 3 kinds of that disease. So there was hereditary, where you contract that from your parents, right? You have a DNA mutation and you contract it. There was, now I'm missing my words, hereditary, sporadic, and what's it called when you get it from the environment? Acquired. There we go, acquired. I was like, it's in there somewhere. I know it is. Acquired was my second kind, where you eat a brain, for example, or you're doing an autopsy on someone that had this disease. So acquired. But then there was also the sporadic form. And in patients with sporadic Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, we have no idea why they contracted it. They aren't in touch with nervous tissue. They don't have a family history. I like to think of sporadic Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease as like, we have no idea why you have it. So when we talk about the sporadic form of ALS, we are talking about the form where you don't have a family history. I don't know what you were exposed to, but you developed ALS. And just like with Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, most people who get ALS, we don't have a really good idea of why. So we're talking about the classical sporadic form of ALS. The most common form that there may not be one particular reason that you have it. So let's look at this sentence as a whole. The sentence as a whole says the cross-sectional area of pyramidal cells in layer 5 of the foot and the tongue areas of the precentral gyrus was measured in people with ALS and in people without ALS. Now, we know what cells are. We may not know about pyramidal cells. This is where I get to draw for you again. Our neurons that I like to draw for you in class, right? We draw them like this with the big long extension. Got those little dendrites. Some of the neurons in the body, especially in the precentral gyrus, are going to look a little bit more like this. Kind of look like a pyramid. Hence, we call them pyramidal cells. So all this sentence is telling me is we're looking at a specific type of neurons that live in the precentral gyrus, specifically the parts of the precentral gyrus that control the foot and control the tongue. When I'm talking about these cells that live in the precentral gyrus, are these going to be upper motor neurons or lower motor neurons? Who lives in the precentral gyrus? Yeah, the upper motor neurons. Okay, my yellow statement is describing the upper motor neurons, the ones that make the decision specifically for movement of the foot and the tongue. All right, let's do what we did before. We did it with the yellow statement. Now we're going to move into our green statement here. In the chat, light me up with what some of the words are underlined in green that you know what they mean. What are some of the words in green that we know what they mean? Okay, so let's start circling here. Cord. L4. Okay, so I just want to point out, I think I've caught most of the things we said we knew here. We've circled most of this statement too, right? So this statement says the areas of motor neurons, so we know what motor neurons are, right? They make stuff happen. In the hypoglossal nuclei and in the ventral horns of the spinal cord were measured. Okay, so this hypoglossal word, we know this one from lab, right? The hypoglossal nerve. Yeah, Carrie's chiming in. Hypoglossal is cranial nerve number 12 that helps me out with movement of the tongue. Hey, movement of the tongue, like we were just looking at up here in the yellow statement, right? So in the yellow statement, we talked about looking at the neurons in the precentral gyrus that control the tongue. Now we went down to what's called the hypoglossal nuclei, which I'll help you out with hypoglossal nuclei. When we use it in this statement, we are talking about the place in the brainstem where the hypoglossal nerve attaches to. So in this sense, we're using the word nuclei like those things we studied in the brain called the basal nuclei. So it's gray matter in the middle of white matter. I've got some gray matter in the brainstem that directly relates to the hypoglossal nerve. I looked inside there at those neurons, the hypoglossal nuclei, the ones that control the tongue. And I looked in the ventral horns, which we all remember from the spinal cord. When I talk about the ventral horns, what kind of neurons, upper motor neurons or lower motor neurons? Who lives in the ventral horn? Do we remember? Upper motor neurons or lower motor neurons? Who's got their cell body in the ventral horn? Yeah, so this is the location of a lower motor neuron, the one that's going to leave the spinal cord and is going to go out to the body. That's the one in the ventral horn. Same deal here with the hypoglossal nuclei. This is the place where the hypoglossal nerve attaches to. So the neurons that live inside of it are the lower motor neurons that are leaving the brainstem to go out to the tongue to help the tongue do its job. So my yellow underlined statement talked about those upper motor neurons that I find in the brain. My green underlined statement talked about the lower motor neurons that I find going out to specifically taking care of the foot and the tongue. That brings us to our blue statement right here. One last time in the chat, light me up. What are some of the words here in blue that we understand? What do we understand in blue? Get my pencil here. I know some of us said cortical. I was waiting for someone. I was like, oh, somebody's got to know ALS, right? We got to know ALS. Okay, let's check this out. My statement here in blue, cortical neurons and lower motor neurons were significantly smaller in the cases of ALS than in the controls. They already labeled these ones correctly for me, right? Lower motor neurons. What is the way that we're talking about cortical neurons, though? What's the name that we use for cortical neurons, the ones that are found in the cerebral cortex? In the case of a tract, the motor neurons that live in the cerebral cortex, they're not called lower motor neurons. They're called do a reminder. Descending tracts have lower motor neurons, and they have, yes, upper motor neurons. upper motor neurons. The lower motor neurons were what we learned about in green. They live in the spinal cord, or they're in the brainstem where they're going out to the tongue. The cortical neurons are the ones that live in the cerebral cortex. They live in the brain. Cortical neurons are the upper motor neurons. That's what we talked about here in yellow, right? The yellow statement describes our upper motor neurons. That's what these cortical neurons are right here, the upper motor neurons. So my statement basically means the upper motor neurons, the one in the cortex, and my lower motor neurons, the ones that I find down lower, going out to places, were both significantly smaller in the cases of ALS. In patients who had this debilitating motor disease, we saw changes in the size, significantly smaller or wasting, in the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So remember back, our question was, is the reason that a patient can't contract their muscles because just the neuron that's down by the muscle has wasted, it's no longer functioning right? Or is it because the neuron that's supposed to send the messages is not functioning correctly? What this paper showed me is that the ones that live up top, the upper motor neurons, and the ones that live in the muscles themselves, by the muscle themselves, were both smaller. We tried to solve the chicken and the egg problem. Did it start with the upper motor neurons, or was it all just the lower motor neurons? And we found out that the upper motor neurons aren't working either. Gotten smaller, as have the lower motor neurons, meaning that this is a problem with both parts of my descending tract. So if you guys were to summarize, I just talked through it. I need you guys to help me out. If you were to describe what you're putting in your notes here, what does the blue statement mean to you? Now that we've talked through it, how are you going to summarize what this blue statement means? What did I find out from this research that we did in the paper here? What did we learn? Yeah, exactly. When we're talking about the types of neurons that ALS affects, it affects both upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. It's not just a problem with one or the other. I've got an upper motor neuron, my one that sends directions, can't do its job. Even if that one could do its job, the one down below it that's supposed to get the directions, it can't do its job either. So it's no surprise that with ALS can't do motor contraction because both of the neurons in the circuit are not functioning correctly. So ALS is a problem with the descending tracts. Upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, both of them cannot do their jobs. What other questions do we have about this one? Or give me a thumbs up. Let's see how we're feeling. One person's dancing. Others of us are still probably typing questions. Oh, fist bump. I like it. Got the cat. Awesome. Okay, so we seem to be feeling a little bit better about it. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to move on to a couple of us asked about the spinal tap thing. So I'm going to move on to talking about spinal tap. And once we finish talking about the spinal tap, I will talk with you guys about current events in anatomy. I got a couple of questions really fast. Let's see. If we have visceral motor neurons in the ventral horn. Well, so question here from Pilar about the ventral horn. The ventral horn does not have visceral motor neurons. The ventral horn is going to have somatic motor neurons. So the visceral motor neurons live in the lateral horn. We're not talking about lateral horn. We're only talking about ventral horn. So I guess I'm just not quite understanding your question, Pilar. Because we're only talking about ALS in the context of descending tracts, not in the context of ascending tracts. Ascending is all sensory. No, it's not that left side or right side is ascending or descending. We've got ascending and descending tracts on both sides of the spinal cord. So it has nothing to do with left side or right side. It just has to do with gray matter or white matter. Gray matter is pretty much always going to be involved either reflexes or deciding that I need to send information up in a tract. Tracts only ever send information up or down. But I find ascending and descending on both sides. Yeah, so hopefully that clears up that confusion there. Good, okay. So let's go to, we'll talk here and use this as a segue into our question here. Remember that when we talk about the spinal cord, I have connective tissue around it. This word meninges should look familiar because it's the same thing that we use to talk about what's around the brain. And the spinal meninges are actually attached to, or they're the same as the meninges around the brain. So if you remember from our discussion of the brain, here's our three meningeal layers right here. Pia mater, arachnoid mater, dura mater. Which of these was the one that's directly attached to the brain? Which means it's directly attached to the spinal cord too. They're the same. Yep, the pia mater, that's the one that's directly attached to the brain. Then I've got some space that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And on the outside of that space, we have what's called the arachnoid mater. Remember, arachnoid mater looks like a spider web. So I'll zoom in really fast to show you. See the little fuzzies that are inside here? These fuzzies inside here, that's parts of my arachnoid mater. I can see some of them up here as well. So it looks like a spider web called the arachnoid mater. And then there's the really thick outer layer called the dura mater. And the dura mater is the one that when we talk about the skull, or we talk about the brain, excuse me, the dura mater is directly attached to your skull. In the spinal cord, we want to keep your spinal cord safe. We kind of wrap it in bubble wrap. So on the outside of the dura mater, this thick layer that I see right here, we have an extra adipose-filled space here on the outside. And that extra adipose-filled space here on the outside is called the epidural space. Remember that epi means above. Epi means above. So above the dura, here's that thick dura layer, we have what's called the epidural space, filled with adipose tissue. Its job is to make sure that the spinal cord doesn't bump into the bones on the front or the back side. I saw that there was a little bit of notes in the chat for me about cerebrospinal fluid, where that's found. Yes, so cerebrospinal fluid is found in the area called the subarachnoid space. The beginning part here, sub, means under. Sub means under. So the subarachnoid space is found under the arachnoid mater. So that's the one that we see here. It's a little bit wider. This dark blue space here, that's the subarachnoid space, which just like we saw in the brain, the subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So that takes us to our question. The first question you guys had is kind of a case study. Now, we'd mentioned this before when we were talking about the brain. We were talking about the condition called meningitis. Remember, meningitis is the swelling of the meninges, the connective tissue that I find around the brain. The best way for you to know you have meningitis, we actually start to feel it in your neck. So the most telltale symptom for this particular patient that we think means he might have meningitis is he has a stiff neck, but he also has a fever. He also has a really bad headache. So his doctor suspects that those connective tissue layers that are wrapping around the brain and the spinal cord might be swollen. This patient, the way we would diagnose this in this patient is we need some cerebrospinal fluid. Which of these spaces that I see listed here in the spinal cord, which of these spaces am I going to go into to get that cerebrospinal fluid? Where do I want to get that from? Exactly. Yep. Several of us are chiming in. I want to get that fluid from the subarachnoid space. Hey, I want to know why, when I do it in class, why do I sometimes get this answer too? Why do we sometimes mention the central canal? Yeah, a couple of us are remembering the central canal does have cerebrospinal fluid in it. Usually when I ask this question in class, I'll get a good number of people that will remember that there is cerebrospinal fluid in the central canal. But like Carrie mentioned, the reason I wouldn't want to take my sample for a spinal tap from the central canal is to get to the central canal, I have to go through the spinal cord itself. Here, let's bounce back to our picture. The central canal is in the very middle of the spinal cord, in the very middle of the gray matter where I've got a ton of neurons. I've got white matter that's on the outside of that. If this was the place that I went in my spinal cord to get my cerebrospinal fluid, guarantee we're going to have big problems with our sensory and motor functions. So there is cerebrospinal fluid in here. It would be good to remember that the central canal has cerebrospinal fluid. But when it comes time for me to collect that fluid in a spinal tap procedure, I can get it not just from the very middle of the spinal cord, I can get it here from the outside in this subarachnoid space area. So my correct answer for my question here, where would I take it from? I'd take it from the subarachnoid space because the subarachnoid space has cerebrospinal fluid and this space is not touching the spinal cord. Now, when you perform the procedure to collect the cerebrospinal fluid, this procedure is called a spinal tap, or the way that my cartoon this morning called it, it's the same thing if we call it a lumbar puncture. A lumbar puncture. That's a little bit of a tip off for me, by the way. It's a lumbar puncture. Where would I go in the spinal cord, or excuse me, the vertebral column? Where would be the best place for me to do this spinal tap? If my goal is to not hit the spinal cord, where would I go to do that? Okay, so Carrie says if the lesson said it was A, that was a typo. So I'll go in and fix that. The correct answer for this one, okay, so I'll get that fixed for you. I apologize. The correct answer for this one has to do with where the spinal cord ends. Who remembers what level of the vertebral column the spinal cord ends at? Where does the spinal cord end? Yeah, here's where the spinal cord is ending at. Remember from our lab packet when we talked about the structure last time called the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris. That's the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord. I find the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord right here at the level of L1 or L2. So if I want to make sure that when I stick my needle into the vertebral column, there's not spinal cord right behind where I stuck my needle into, I want to go down below between the L3 and L4 vertebrae. If I go down that low, that's going to allow me to make sure I don't hit the spinal cord. So the correct answer for this one, and I'll get that fixed in the lesson, I apologize, is going to be down here between the L3 and L4 vertebrae. If I'm down that low, I know I'm not going to bump into the conus medullaris. I know I'm not going to bump into the spinal cord. I have to be mindful of my nerves still because there's nerves all over the place down here. But hitting a nerve is a lot better than hitting the spinal cord itself. If you did it in region C, then a mess up could cost you all limb function. Absolutely, yes. If we did it in region C or anywhere higher than that, it would cost me a lot. And that's where we get into those damage to the spinal cord questions, right? So I could lose leg function if we're down here in L1, L2. If we're up here in C1, C2, we could lose all kinds of function. So yes, the place we're going to perform that is down here L3, L4. And I'll mention we've got our picture here. Here is what they're calling the lumbar spinal puncture site, or a spinal tap, or a lumbar puncture. There's lots of different things that we use to describe it. Notice though when I'm looking at this, so I stick my needle in between, here's the spinous process of L3 and the spinous process of L4. I stick that needle into the space here where I have fluid. Now, to be fair, this is not just an empty space, right? There's all kinds of little nerves inside of here. So I'm adding my little nerves here. But if we go in very slowly, we can avoid damaging those nerves, collect some of that fluid that comes out for us. Notice the other thing, and we kind of briefly mentioned this in class last time. We mentioned the idea of epidurals or epidural anesthesia. Hey, it's not a trick question. When we talk about epidural anesthesia, which space are we going to be putting epidural anesthesia inside of? When I administer this medication, yeah, it's going into the epidural space. So epidural anesthesia, we technically don't even go into the dura. We technically stay on the outside of the dura, and we put our medication there on the outside. So that stays on the outside. When we do a spinal tap or when we do a lumbar puncture, we're going into those meninges because we need that fluid that's on the inside. I noticed that Carrie had a quick question about shingles. Let me just mention really fast. So shingles is an issue. Who can help me out here? Shingles is an issue with the same virus that causes another common condition in the body. For you to get shingles, you had to get something first. Yep, for you to get shingles, you had to get chickenpox first. So patient gets chickenpox. The way that the shingles story starts, patient gets the chickenpox. So the chickenpox then, that virus, it's the varicella zoster virus. That virus causes a skin rash that's all over the body. You've got chickenpox. Then that virus goes and it hides inside your spinal nerves. As you get older, as your immune system weakens, or I always like to point out in class too, as we get to this point in the semester where we're like way stressed out, right? Stress decreases your immune system. So for whatever reason, your immune function goes down. Varicella zoster, this virus that's living inside your spinal nerve, can reactivate. So Carrie's question specifically is, can we prevent shingles? Two ways to prevent shingles. First way to prevent shingles is prevent chickenpox. So the chickenpox vaccine prevents you from being able to develop shingles, because the first thing that has to happen for you to get shingles is you got to get chickenpox. So in childhood, the chickenpox vaccine not only blocks chickenpox, it's also preventing later in life developing shingles. The second way that you can block getting shingles is they do actually have vaccines. So to help your depressed immune system, or to help your aging immune system be ready to fight it if the virus tries to reactivate, you can actually get a vaccine for it as well. But if you have had chickenpox, there's a very good chance this virus is living inside your nerves, and it might reactivate. And so just to show you, I know that you don't have these pictures in your notes side by side, but when we're looking at the patterns that you see with shingles, a shingles rash, notice how I can see this one across the chest here that's in a line. When I look at this one across the buttocks region, see how this one kind of goes at a diagonal line? If you check out my dermatomes, because I'm not gonna cover everything. I'm gonna make you do a little reading about dermatomes. But check this out. My dermatomes in this region goes down in a line, just like we see this rash here along the buttocks region. And notice I'm looking here in the arm region. The arm, notice how my dermatomes go down in a line again. So when you're looking at these pictures of the different kinds of rashes, look back at your dermatomes map to show you, because shingles will affect a single dermatome. Yeah, so I'm not sure, Carrie, about this specific age that they offer it. I do know, though, that I had a friend who had shingles activate when she was in her 20s because she was really stressed and immunocompromised. So if it's something you're worried about, definitely chat with your doctor and see. It's very painful. It's not deadly. I don't think shingles will kill you, but it's very painful. So you could chat with your doctor and see. All that to say. Yeah, Mary Lou says she got it from her stressful job. Yeah, stress is probably the #1 zapper of our immune systems. So yeah, you also just got the vaccine. Yeah, vaccine is totally worth it. It is definitely one that I will be vaccinating myself for when I get a little bit older. Okay, I only have 5 minutes left, so I want to talk with you guys really fast about current events in anatomy. So let me pull up right here. Oh my, there we go. Okay, so I am in our course Blackboard site. Let me show you how I got here. So I'm over here in lecture resources. Let me go back to the lecture resources. In lecture resources, I added a new folder last night, current events in anatomy. So you click on this folder right here. This has everything you need to complete this assignment. So what current events in anatomy is your nerd teacher goes through and reads news stories that are related to science and medicine. And then I save those stories with little tags, with little messages to tell you what the topics are or how it relates back to our class. So what you need to do, everybody in the class has to do at least one of these things. So step 1 in current events in anatomy, what you're going to do is go on your computer and download this worksheet right here. This worksheet is your template for every article that you're going to summarize, and for every article that you're using for this assignment, you'll complete this worksheet fresh each time. So download it, and then we'll save it as Unit 1, current events, Unit 2, current events, etc. So everybody, you start by downloading this. Then you'll go to this website here at the top. That is the list of articles. So all the things that I've tagged for you guys, all the articles that I've read over the years, literally it's probably been about 5 years. So 5 years worth of articles right here. You click on this website, it'll take you to a place where you can link to each of those articles. Find one that's really interesting to you, then use that article to complete your worksheet. Now, each of the articles, like I said, are tagged to let you know what topics are covered, or to let you know basically which unit in our class it relates to. Because you can do, for your one submission, everybody's got to do one submission. I don't care which unit you do your one submission on. If you really loved Unit 3 about the brain, go for it, do Unit 3. If you really loved protein stuff, do Unit 2, that's totally fine. If you're wanting to do extra credit, which I suspect many of us are wanting to do extra credit, you need to make sure that you pick articles 1 from each of the units. So this is the list that will help you know which unit your article comes from, whether it's Unit 1, 2, 3, or 4, has a list for you of what those tags are. So you can use this as a reference for you to help you figure out which unit your article relates to. Once you have completed the worksheet by summarizing your article from up here, then you'll submit it right here in the Dropbox. This Dropbox is set to accept 4 submissions. So the first one that comes in is going to be your one that's your normal assignment. So whatever unit you pick, submit me your first one. Make sure it's really well done. It'll be 10 points out of 10 points when you complete that worksheet. You can do up to 3 extra ones. So each of those extra ones is worth 5 points each. So we have a total possibility of getting 25 points out of 10 points on this assignment if you do your one article, and the summary and the way it relates back to class is really good. That gets you 10 points out of 10. Any extra ones that you do, again, from the other units in our class, any extra ones that you do are 5 points each. That will go into your total in that column. Like I said, up to 25 out of 10. All right, let me go back to the chat, see what we're saying here. Okay, so yes, this is a lecture assignment. Yes, all of them are due by May 1st. May 1st, so well, I don't want to navigate away here. Let's talk some dates. If you have a piece of paper, this might be a good time to write down some dates for you. So looking at my calendar here, next week, the week of the 20th, is our lab exam. That's the big thing next week, right? Week after that is lecture exam number 4. So that's going to cover spinal cord and special senses. At the end of that week, May 1st, that Friday, that is when all of these article submissions need to be in by. That's because the next week is finals week. Your lecture final exam here would be something we can write down, and I'll make sure to type it later to give to you guys. Your lecture final exam is going to open up Monday, May 4th at probably 9:30 in the morning, because that's when lecture classes started. And it will be open until 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, the 5th. So that exam is going to be open Monday and Tuesday of finals week. You will need to have all of your article submissions done by Friday night, because I don't want you wasting your study time for the final exam reading articles. I mean, it's not a waste. They're very interesting to me, but there are probably better ways and more effective ways for you to be studying and to be frantically doing all of your current events in anatomy. So all of those assignments due by May 1st. Honestly, you could go in now and you could do all 4 of them, because we've just talked about the spinal cord. So you can find yourself a spinal cord article to get unit number 4. But if you want to wait on unit number 4, because I do have some really cool stuff about special sense, if you want to wait to do unit 4, you could go through today and do units 1, 2, and 3 and get those submitted in there. So you've got a couple of weeks on this assignment. I know it's crunch time in a lot of classes, so I want to make sure to give you plenty of time. So Friday, May 1st, by then, all of your submissions need to come in, but you could be submitting as early as today. We could go home and start working on it today. What other questions do we have right now? The lecture final exam will end Tuesday night at midnight. So we got to have it done by Tuesday night at midnight. Maybe I'll open it up Monday morning at 7:30, give you a little bit extra time. So Monday morning first thing through Tuesday at the very end of the day. Okay, well, please do favor. Yes, the final exam will be cumulative. Will we have office hours those days? Probably the last office hours will be on Monday. But the week before, I will be doing, so let me pull up my calendar again. So like on the 1st, probably like the 30th and the 1st, both of those days, I will be doing just general lecture final exam review. Again, I'm going to need you guys to bring questions, right? Because I don't know what we need to cover. So the 30th and the 1st, and then probably again on the 4th, those will be office hours to review stuff for the final exam. So there will be some review days built in. Yes. I'm not sure what you want me to repeat, Pauline. Help me out what you missed so I know what to repeat. So Mary Lou's asking about the last group assignment. So the last group assignment, I may give you until May 3rd on that one, because it's going to be related to the entire class and not just unit 4. So that is still forthcoming. If you want to plan on it being due on May 1st, that's not a bad idea. It won't be any earlier than May 1st. Yes, the final exam is cumulative. It's going to go from units 1 through unit 4. So the dates, Pauline, it opens up Monday morning, May 4th, and it closes Tuesday night at 11:49 or 11:59. I guess if you think 11:49, you'll definitely get it done in time, right? So first thing Monday to the end of day Tuesday has to be completed in that time block. Okay, well, what I want you guys to do, please send out information in your GroupMe to classmates. Right now, the most important information to get out to them is tell them to check out current events. And please, I would ask that all of you try to check out current events as well. because I would like you to bring some questions for me so I can address those specifically. So please start working on those current events assignments. Tell your classmates that that is available. You can make it known to them the 2 days actually of the final exam so they know when it's coming. I can't answer the question about how many questions it has at this point because honestly, I've got 2 other exams to write between now and then. So in class, it'd be a 100 question exam. So plan for 100. It's not going to be more than 100. I don't think it's going to be 100, but that's what it would be if we were taking it in class. So don't know about how many questions, don't know about how much time. When I have that information, I will get that to you as soon as I have it. So, all right, I'm going to stop our recording for the day. So goodbye to my friends on the recording. Hope to see you soon.